I'm Andrew Schwartz, and you're listening to The Truth of the Matter, a podcast by CSIS where we break down the top policy issues of the day and talk with the people that can help us best understand what's really going on. To get to the truth of the matter about a really important new report by the Commission on the National Defense Strategy's final report to Congress and the President of the United States, we have with us Dr. Seth Jones, the head of our International Security Program and our Harold Brown Chair. But we also have Ambassador Eric Edelman here with us, who is the Vice Chair of the Commission on National Defense Strategy. Of course, Ambassador Edelman served as U.S. Ambassador to Finland, to Turkey in the Clinton and George Bush administrations, and was Principal Deputy Assistant to the Vice President for National Security Affairs. From 2005 to 2009, he was the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, and in other assignments, he served as the Chief of Staff to the Deputy Secretary of State, Special Assistant to the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, and Special Assistant to Secretary of State George Shultz. Welcome to both of you. And can you tell me, Ambassador Edelman, why was this commission created and what were the goals?
Andrew, I'm happy to do that. But first, thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here with Seth, who I regard as a great colleague, both in and out of government. The National Defense Strategy Commission is the successor to a number of its predecessors that were created by Congress, in essence, to give the Congress a second opinion on the Department of Defense's plans for its future program. So back in the late 1990s, Congress created something called the National Defense Panel, which was meant to give a then Republican Congress a sort of second opinion on the quadrennial defense review that Secretary of Defense Bill Cohen had done up for the Clinton administration. In 2010, Congress mandated that there be another commission, an independent panel, to review the then QDR, Quadrennial Defense Review of the Department of Defense. And there was a similar panel in 2014, the National Defense Panel, to review the QDR in 2014, and then a subsequent panel in 2018 to review the Trump administration's National Defense Strategy. And then this panel is the most recent successor to those. I'm sorry to admit that I am a recidivist. I served on all four of the ones since 2010.
But they've all been getting better, so there's been improvement.
They're going to make me keep doing it until I get it right.
And this is why Seth Jones is my favorite guest on the podcast, because he always looks at the bright side of things. Let me ask you, though, tell me a little bit about the making of this report and who was involved and what kind of work went into it.
The Congress essentially appointed 8 commissioners. The number of commissioners going back to 2010 has varied. It's been as large as, I think, 18 or 20 and as small as 8. The commissioners were appointed essentially by the Senate majority and minority leaders, the Speaker of the House and the House minority leader, and then the ranking chairs of the committees of jurisdiction, the Senate Armed Services Committee and the House Armed Services Committee. In my case, I was appointed by Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, and I served along with 3 colleagues appointed by Republicans who the positions of which I just mentioned. So they were Thomas Mencken, the president and CEO of the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, General Jack Keane, retired former Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, and Roger Zackheim, the Executive Director of the Ronald Reagan Institute. All 4 of us were recidivists. We were on the 2018 panel that reviewed the Trump strategy. And on the Democratic side, we had our chair, Jane Harman. I was the vice chair, but Jane was our chair, former representative from Los Angeles area, in fact, a major aerospace district. Then we had Mara Rudman, who was a Deputy National Security Advisor in the Clinton administration and an Assistant Aid Administrator in the Obama administration and the Middle East Envoy. We had Mariah Sixkiller, who was National Security Advisor to House Minority Leader Steny Hoyer, or Minority Whip Steny Hoyer. We had Alyssa Starzak, who's a former General Counsel of the Army in the Obama Department of Defense.
And tell me, how aligned were everyone's interests and opinions of the U.S. defense apparatus?
In partial answer to your earlier question, we spent 18 months getting a range of briefings and meetings with the entire senior leadership of the Department of Defense. We met with the secretary, the deputy, the chiefs of the services, all of the services, the head of the Guard Bureau. We met with service secretaries. We met with the Undersecretary for Personnel and Readiness. We met with essentially all the senior leaders, all the combatant commanders, as well as others in important positions in the Department of Defense. We also met with representatives of most of the important elements of defense industry, both those who represent the primes, the major defense contractors who are part of the defense industrial base, but as well as some of the new entrants who are making, a bid to provide goods and services to the department in sort of non-traditional areas, not the big major platforms for which the Department of Defense has optimized itself over the last, 40, 50, 60 years.
Let's get to the findings, though, because that's what we all want to talk about. What are some of the key findings? And I know Seth is going to want to jump in on some of this subject matter.
So I think our main findings were that, that number one, that the general direction of the National Defense Strategy, which is a continuation of the strategy that was outlined in the Trump administration in 2018 in many ways, which sees China as the so-called pacing challenge, but also great power competition with Russia and continued concern about North Korea, Iran, as well as threat from violent Muslim extremists and other terrorist groups around the world, that general direction is correct. And we found that the senior leadership is trying to do the right thing to get the Department of Defense, into a better posture to address these concerns after having spent 20 years fighting the post 9/11 wars against terrorism. That's a different kind of conflict to prepare for than, potentially with great powers. And we found the leadership doing its best. But having said that, I think we concluded, and this was unanimous, it was bipartisan and unanimous, that the challenge that the United States is now facing from a modernizing military in China, a revanchist power in Russia, and the increasing collaboration we see between the two of them and with Iran and North Korea is the greatest national security challenge, as former Secretary of Defense Bob Gates has said, that the United States has faced since 1945, and that the Department of Defense, despite the best efforts of senior leaders, remains unprepared for this and lacking in certain regards that we can talk about in preparing it, and that the public is unprepared for this and not quite ready. We see the intensifying cooperation among these four major actors, what Seth has called in another context, the Legion of Doom, as being a huge challenge for the United States. And the American public has not really been educated to what this might mean in the future, including things like in a future conflict. It's very likely that although we tend to think of conflict in sort of kind of regional stovepipes, the Indo-Pacific, Europe, the Middle East, it's very hard to imagine a future conflict not becoming a global one pretty quickly. And what that would entail for the American public, the potential costs, we don't think has been internalized by the public or really senior leadership in the Department of Defense, for that matter, below the level of the secretary, the deputy, and some of the very top leaders. You get down into the bowels of the bureaucracy. People don't seem to be quite ready for this, including things like the homeland not being a sanctuary this time around, as it has been in the past.
Seth, I know you want to jump in on this, so please do.
I think there are a couple of really important big strategic level conclusions that the commission reaches that I think are important and I think are not fully appreciated by the American population. One is there is a big advance, I would say, from the Trump administration and the Biden administration's national defense strategy, both of which moved on from the counterterrorism concerns after 9/11 to focus on competition with states. I think what this commission concludes, and this is really a change, I think, even since the 2022 Biden national defense strategy was released, is we're seeing a lot more cooperation between adversaries than we have since the end of the Cold War in some important categories. And this is really even true since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So if we take the Chinese, for example, while they've tried to publicly deny that they're providing much to the Russians, we've seen everything from microprocessors and chips used on precision weapon systems to global navigation satellite system boards to antennas for military vehicles, drones, various types of MAVICs, for example, DJIs, and drone components, lots of stuff that are used to produce gunpowder, rocket propellants, and other explosives like cut and cellulose. Just a lot of material that goes inside of weapon systems. The Iranians have done the same with the Russians, with the Shahed 136s, and not just providing those weapon systems, those are drones, but also building a facility in Yelabuga in Russia so that the Russians can produce Iranian drones, North Koreans, artillery, rockets, short-range ballistic missiles, and other munitions. We've seen recently the Russians and the Chinese flying strategic bombers off the coast of the United States or engaged in exercises. All of this highlights a change. If you're looking at U.S. war plans or the way our combatant commands are structured and operate, I think a lot of this raises some big questions about whether U.S. defense writ large is prepared for the environment that now exists. And I think this is one of the big conclusions that I think the commission comes out of. The other is, even on the Chinese side, what Ambassador Edelman and his colleagues have pointed out is something that I think is deeply concerning, which is that I think most Americans probably do not appreciate that China in some areas is outpacing the United States and has largely negated the U.S. military advantage in some areas, what we've typically called overmatch. And I think, it's interesting when you look at the maritime, for example, shipbuilding. China's shipbuilding capacity is about 230 times the size of the U.S. One of China's major shipbuilding locations is larger than all of the U.S.'s combined. We're seeing advances on the hypersonics, space, and counter space capabilities. A big China push to build a larger and more sophisticated stockpile of nuclear weapons. The system that the Chinese uses to connect its military components, the rough comparison to the U.S.'s Joint All-Domain Command and Control System, the Chinese have a version of it. So, across the board, the Chinese have put a lot of money and emphasis. And I think when we look at comparative U.S. advantages, I think the commission really is blunt, I think, in saying that U.S. advantages in a range of areas has eroded and China is outpacing the United States. And I think one has to grapple with that, because when you look at the industrial base, when you look at the amount of money the U.S. spends, including as a percentage of GDP on defense, there's some big implications when you put those two things together: strategic environment that exists and that some of the U.S.'s adversaries are pacing in some key areas. So, those are some big conclusions that I think are important and probably not fully appreciated.
Well, so I want to get into that a little bit, because the report does state that China is outpacing the U.S. in terms of military investments. And Seth, you've alluded to that this is cause for concern, but I want to ask you, Ambassador Edelman, and then you to follow up too on this, Seth, and expand on it. How big of a concern is it? Don't we still have the advantage currently in terms of carrier groups and weaponry and sophistication, not to mention know-how? We've fought wars they haven't in a very long time. How much cause for concern is this?
Well, Andrew, I would say a couple of things on that. One is it's true that we still have some areas of advantage, including undersea warfare. But I think the reality is, if you sit on your laurels, it won't be an advantage for very long, because the Chinese are, as Seth just pointed out, making massive investments in trying to negate our advantages. And if you want to talk about carriers, for instance, the problem is when we start to get within 1,000 nautical miles of Western Pacific, we start to have problems, because the Chinese have developed capabilities that can hold some of our very expensive, very hard to replace platforms at extreme risk because of their anti-ship ballistic missiles, anti-ship cruise missiles, a whole plethora of systems that they've developed that have generally gone under the rubric of anti-access area denial. The Chinese have been studying our way of war since the first Gulf War, and they are determined not to allow us to have the ease of access to the waters around Taiwan that we would have had 20 or 30 years ago. All of this is, I want to hasten to add, there's no shortage of critics who looked at our report and said, "Oh, these people just want more money for defense contractors, or they're warmongers. They're pushing for a war with China." I don't think that's true at all. I think all 8 of us are united by a desire to avoid war. As the Romans used to say, if you want peace, you have to prepare for war. And what this is really about is deterrence. And one of the things that I think the commissioners, I certainly among them, were very concerned about is that the United States appears to be losing its margin of advantage and therefore its ability to deter China from taking military action, for instance, to either seize Taiwan or more likely impose a blockade around Taiwan that would make it extremely difficult for the United States to break that blockade without leading to a major conflict. I think this is really about restoring American deterrence ultimately. But as Seth rightly points out, we are approaching a low point, hovering right around 3% of GDP that we've spent on defense. And that's just not up to the task. I mean, when we met as a commission 6 years ago to review the Trump National Defense Strategy, we concluded that 3 to 5% annual real growth was the minimum necessary to execute that strategy. We came back 6 years later, we found the situation has actually deteriorated in terms of the military balance. Some of the other deficiencies that we identified in 2018 have not been completely remediated. Not least of them is it's not clear that we have a concept for how we would fight a war, and therefore we haven't been able to, I think, exercise that and communicate it to our adversaries the way we did at the tail end of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, when we developed concepts like air-land battle, assault breaker, the NATO concept of follow-on forces attack that we went out and exercised repeatedly in Europe, and which I think ultimately convinced the Soviet leadership that, trying to match us was a fool's errand and led to the negotiated end of the Cold War. We don't have those kinds of concepts today. We have a joint warfighting concept that's kind of on its third iteration. I've joked with Seth in another venue that it's like the Holy Roman Empire. It's not joint, it's not about warfighting, and it's not a concept. I mean, it's basically a series of efforts to remediate operational problems that the Chinese have created for us. But it is not something that we can go out and exercise and show the Chinese, look, here's how we're going to beat you and thwart your effort to enforce your will on us. And so this is all about restoring deterrence, in my view.
Seth, I know that's something you lay awake at night thinking about as well. Can you give us some of your thoughts?
Yeah, Andrew, I think one of the things that is a little concerning is a range of the war games that have been done both inside and outside of government, including ones that we've done at CSIS. I know Ambassador Edelman has been involved in a number as well, and particularly ones that take place in areas like the Taiwan Strait or the South China Sea. There are a couple of interesting things that come out of many of them. One of them is that the U.S. industrial base, as it stands right now, is not prepared for a protracted conflict. And I think one of the lessons that we hopefully have learned from the war in Ukraine, which is now in its third year, is that those kinds of major conventional wars, particularly protracted ones, equipment's blown up or it needs spare parts, it breaks down, or munitions are used and need to be replaced. So long-range anti-ship missiles, PAC-3, Standard Missile 6, SM-6s, Tomahawks, that in this kind of a protracted war, particularly one in an area like the Taiwan Strait, you're going to need a fair amount of these. And the reality in the various war games, including one series of them that we did at CSIS, is we ran out of long-range anti-ship missiles in a week. Those kinds of findings, which we ran by our Navy and Air Force colleagues in the Indo-Pacific, they have very similar results from not just their war games, but their estimates. That's a disturbing outcome. It's one that I think is broadly in sync with the commission's report. And in addition, those wars, it is not clear, depending on a range of variables, it's not clear the U.S. wins in some of these wars either. War games are one cut into a very complicated future. You've got to make some assumptions in each of these war games. But I think what they suggest is it is not a foregone conclusion that the U.S. wins in a major protracted conventional war. Again, the point here is, I think it needs to be emphasized what Eric mentioned. This is not about anybody wanting to fight a war. This is about deterring one. So I think one of the real successes of the Cold War was, as we saw Soviet and Warsaw Pact forces built up around the inter-German border, including the Fulda Gap area, we did not have World War III. The Soviets were deterred. So the issue here is not fighting, because we hope that doesn't happen, but it's deterring a conflict. And I think that's where we're not prepared. So if you're not prepared to fight, you're definitely not prepared to deter.
Andrew, if I could just add to something that Seth just said about munitions. So in our 2018 report, we drew attention to the fact that the U.S. Air Force in 2015 almost ran out of precision munitions in the counter ISIL campaign. And we drew attention to that and said, this is a potential weakness. And we did that because a number of us on that commission were aware of the fact that the Department of Defense has historically, when it balances its books at the end of the fiscal year, has traditionally taken money out of essentially the buys for munitions. And it's always done under the same kind of rationale, which is, well, we need this for more immediate needs that we have to do now. It's okay, next year we'll get whole and we'll replenish our munition stocks. And the problem is it never happens. And so we have, as Seth has pointed out, a shortage of munitions. And we also have, and Seth adverted to this in his comments as well, we have a shrunken defense industrial base that's gone from, and Seth will know better than I, but something like 10 prime contractors at the end of the Cold War to like 3.5 maybe now. And they're not in a position, nor are their subs, the subcontractors, in a position to easily ramp up production. And we've seen dramatic evidence of that in Ukraine, right? Just with the issue of 155 artillery rounds. Bill LaPlante, the Undersecretary for Acquisition, who is, one of those leaders we think is doing a fantastic job under very adverse circumstances, is trying to get production up to an appropriate level of 100,000 rounds a month. But, you're talking about the North Koreans providing the Russians, as Seth was talking about, with 2 million rounds of 152 ammunition, which is what the Russians use. So we're at a tremendous disadvantage, and our industry is not in a position. This is why I think Seth was saying in a protracted conflict, we could find ourselves, really at a serious disadvantage. They're not in a position to rapidly scale up production of these limited munitions, and that's part a floor space issue. They don't have enough floor space, and all the munitions tend to be built in pretty much the same plants. So you got to decide which one you want. You can't, there's just physics here that, can't be gainsaid. These are kind of artisanal production. This isn't Model T Fords, coming off a production line in Detroit in the 1920s or 30s. Kind of artisanal production. You need a very highly educated, highly trained workforce, and we have huge shortages of workers who can fill those positions.
Andrew, one of the things that for me was stunning was when Defense News put out its data for top 100 defense companies in the world in 2024. And it combines both defense and non-defense revenue, in part because with a number of companies, they can move back and forth a little bit. For the first time in the data, the top two entries are both Chinese. The Aviation Industry Corporation of China is now the largest producer in the world. Now that's combining defense and non-defense revenues. The second is also Chinese, China State Shipbuilding Corporation Limited. And number four, so three of the top four are Chinese. Number four is China North Industries Group Corporation Limited. So, there has been a fundamental shift on the production side as well, that the data is now, I think, advertising. That gives one a sense of where some of the production capacity globally is now shifting. U.S. is now as number 3, 7, 8, but the Chinese are 1 and 2.
All this speaks to a very different world that we find ourselves living in now, where national security is economic security, is technology, does have a lot to do with industrial policy. If we're getting beat right now, as you all point out, what do we need to do to get back to the top quickly?
Well, I don't think it's going to be quick. I think it's going to take a very long, concerted effort. Some of it requires throwing money at the problem. We talked about resources earlier. One of the things we say in our report is if we're talking about something that is at least at the level of the Cold War, if not beyond what we faced in the Cold War, then in Cold War levels of effort, are going to be required at a minimum. The average we spent annually in the Cold War was, I think, 4.9% of GDP, although in the height of the Cold War, it was more like 6 to 8%. High point was 16% in fiscal, I think, 51 after the outbreak of the Korean War. Not talking about going to 16% of GDP. Don't worry. Nobody have a heart attack, please. But we are talking about ramping up and having a kind of concerted national effort over a period of time. That's point one. Point two is, I made the point earlier that the Pentagon's procurement system is optimized to buy very large, very hard to replace, exquisite systems. They're a product of the requirements process we have, where essentially whenever we build something, anybody can add a requirement and no one can take one off. And so we have very, very expensive sort of bespoke systems. If we just pour these additional resources that our commission is calling for into those programs of record, we won't get to where we need to be. Seth was talking earlier about some of the lessons from what's going on in Ukraine, or frankly, for what's going on in the Middle East as well. I'm not saying we don't need any of the older platforms. We need many of those, but we need a lot more attritable, inexpensive, smart munitions that you're changing the software, not the hardware all the time. Things like the Replicator initiative that Deputy Secretary Hicks, to her credit, has been spearheading in the Department of Defense, which has produced, I think, 1,000 Switchblade UAVs. That's great, but we need, maybe that times, an order of magnitude to get to where we need to be. So we've got to, spend more money, but also spend it differently and on different kinds of systems.
One additional comment, Andrew, is I think as I look at the last century, particularly in the years before World War II, and then if you look at U.S. defense production over the course of the Cold War during the famous Last Supper years where the U.S. consolidates, the defense industry, defense budgets decline pretty dramatically. And then even more recently, in periods where the U.S. really has needed to revitalize, so like the 1930s, for example, before the U.S. ever becomes involved directly in World War II, the effort to revitalize the defense industrial base was presidential level. I mean, this was Franklin Roosevelt, the Democratic president of the United States, well before Pearl Harbor, establishes a National Defense Advisory Commission with the full weight of the president and the White House to coordinate efforts across the industrial base, production, raw materials, employment, price stabilization, consumer protection. That eventually, during the war, becomes the War Production Board. Truman has something a little bit different, the Civilian Production Administration and the Office of Defense Mobilization. Eisenhower's got something a little bit different, the Office of Defense and Civil Mobilization. Reagan's got something a little bit different. But one thing that's common across these presidents, both Democratic and Republican, is they really require the weight of the President of the United States and the White House, in part because defense, and I'm going to use quotations here, is now well beyond just the Department of Defense. The State Department gets involved in technology transfers. Commerce has a role. Obviously, Congress does. And so I think part of the challenge today is without the White House really taking the initiative, partly funding, partly urgency, partly attention, and breaking some of the bureaucratic gridlock that Ambassador Edelman's commission identifies, I just find it highly unlikely that without that kind of presidential support that will get a lot of these recommendations really followed through, because I think they require something above the pay grade, frankly, even of a Secretary of Defense or a Secretary of State. That's a bit of the challenge we have right now is it's going to take a president to do that, I think.
Andrew, again, if I could just kind of build on what Seth has said, China has basically a whole of society approach to this. They think all of society is involved, even though they've got kind of a market economy. They've got a Leninist political party that runs the whole place. And they've got something they call civil military fusion that allows them to take what's happening in the commercial side of the economy and then apply it to purposes of defense. We need an effort now that it's harder for us because of the nature of our government and our system, which makes it hard to concentrate power. I mean, one of the things about the founding of the American Republic is that the founders had a deep fear of concentrated political and economic power. And they arranged a system to make it very difficult for people to do that. But we need a whole of government approach that harnesses all the elements of national power that we have, including the incredible innovation base that we have, the ability to innovate and harness it to the purpose of creating the defense capability and the government capability we need across the board to deter our adversaries. Seth is right. I do think it's going to take presidential level involvement to make that happen.
I want to ask you both finally about alliances. Clearly in this report, it states the United States cannot win a war without strengthening its alliances and integrating its military efforts with those allies. Tell me more about that. That seems to be a topic that we've talked about a lot in these last 3 years when it comes to Ukraine, and certainly now also, as you point out, Ambassador Edelman, when it comes to the Middle East.
Well, look, America's alliances, both its integrated multinational military alliance in Europe and NATO, and its bilateral treaty relationships with Japan, the Republic of Korea, the Philippines, and the defense ties we have with Taiwan. It's not a treaty anymore. It was once upon a time, but it's now kind of enshrined in the Taiwan Relations Act, as well as our special relationships in the Middle East. We don't have treaties in the Middle East, although we might have one soon with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. I don't know. We'll see. But we have obligations to those partners we have in the region. That's been one of our great comparative strategic advantages against our adversaries, who don't really have much in the way of alliances. Although, as Seth has said, increasing alliance-like relationships we see developing among Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran are extremely troubling. We've got a war being waged, the largest land war in Europe since 1945, where the losses for Russia are absolutely staggering, 350 to 500,000 casualties, including perhaps as many as 130, 140,000 killed on the Russian side, not to mention all the casualties in Ukraine. As Seth pointed out earlier, it's being funded and supported by the PRC with its export of dual-use goods, including things like precision machine tooling that enable the Russian defense industry to go onto a 3-shift-a-day, 24/7 footing. You've got the Iranian supply of drones and the building of the factory that Seth already mentioned, as well as the North Korean provision of artillery and rockets and missiles, including solid-fueled missiles. This is really something we haven't ever seen in the past, and it is, I think, again, it highlights the importance that our alliances play, both for giving us, physical access to geography that's important to us, but also aggregating power to sort of balance that of our adversaries. And I do worry that, both on the right and the left, there's a tendency to shortchange these alliances and to think that they're not really very important to maintain and nurture. And from my experience in government as a diplomat, I will tell you that notwithstanding the tendency of academic international relations theory to tell you that nations just by nature balance one another and they don't bandwagon with each other, in my 30-year government career, I never met anybody who believed that. Everybody I worked with, including George Shultz, who was my boss, believed that alliances were like gardening and you had to tend to them, sort of every day of the year.
Seth, you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, Andrew, I think U.S. relationships, alliances, partnerships with its key allies and its key partners, they are the bedrock of much as I cannot really conceive of a major war and therefore deterrence without the important role of U.S. allies and partners. And it's a major advantage, I think, that the U.S. has in all regions over its adversaries is very limited alliances that they have, I mean, you look at the U.S. alliance with Europe through NATO, you look at the strong relations the U.S. continues to develop with the Australians and the U.K. through AUKUS, the Japanese, the progress that's been made between the Japanese and the Koreans, their concerns about Chinese and North Korean activity, and even Russian for that matter. I think also probably one of the most significant advantages I think the U.S. and its allies have is also their economic systems, which are at their core, bottom-up, innovative, capitalist. If you look at the Chinese industrial base, it's primarily state-owned enterprises, which has some advantages in mass and scale, but probably not an innovation in some key areas. And when you look at a lot of the multinational companies building a range of components that are part of the supply chain, that cutting edge innovation in quantum, artificial intelligence that we've seen, a lot of the Western companies are driving, not all of it, but much of it. The advantages in chips and semiconductors, still a lot of advantages from US, Taiwanese, South Korean, Japanese, and other companies. Where I worry a little bit is the bureaucracy that still exists in cooperating across countries. There's a pretty heavy technology control guardrails that make it difficult for companies, even between the US and Australia or the US and the UK, co-develop, co-produce, co-sustain on key defense and even dual use items. There's often a very difficult process. I've talked to a lot of companies that don't even start the development process because it's so challenging. There's been a little progress, Andrew, with AUKUS, but I think, the areas that AUKUS identifies, we haven't seen enough progress in AI, quantum, advanced cyber capabilities, and undersea capabilities. It's still been, in my view, more talk than action. So I think we've got some work to do in not just talking about allies and partners, but actually cooperating in building some of the material we're talking about. Still have work to do. A lot of it, frankly.
Ambassador Edelman, I'd love to give you the last word. What do you hope that Congress does with this information, with this report and your findings?
Well, a couple of things, Andrew. First, when Jane Harman and I testified at the end of last month before the Senate Armed Services Committee, I think by and large we got a understanding and pretty warm response from most of the members on both sides of the aisle. That's not altogether surprising because the members of the Senate Armed Services Committee spend a lot of time every year working on the National Defense Authorization Act, holding hearings on various aspects of what we were talking about in the report. They're familiar with a lot of the issues that we raised, and I think they share many of the concerns that we expressed in the report. Actually, one of the things that was kind of interesting was Senator Wicker, the ranking Republican on the committee, said he thought that the hearing we had on July 30th would be the most important hearing that they would hold this year. And that's not just to enhance the importance of our report. The issues that we were raising, I think he believes are of sufficient import that it's the most significant hearing they're holding. They need to propagate kind of the awareness of these issues with, in the first instance, the rest of the United States Senate. I mean, there's something like 21 or something members of the committee. That's not the exact number, but that means that roughly 80% of the Senate, is not as aware of these things as the members of the Committee of Jurisdiction. So they need to make their colleagues aware of how serious this is. I hope that they will then move to get rid of the ceilings that we've imposed as a result of the budget deal that will enable, more money for defense. People are, act as if, more money for defense. How are we going to do that? It's politically unpopular. Well, defense expenditures right now are 13% of federal outlays, which is pretty close to a historic low. We spend more money servicing the debt, which is like 15% of the budget, than we do on national defense. When people worry about the budget itself, if you look at all of the CBO 20-year projections of the long-term debt, the driver for all of that is Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, which is one of the reasons why our commission, and again, this was bipartisan, commission said, we're going to have to do some things that are not politically popular. We need more revenue. We're probably going to have to increase taxes. But we're also going to have to reform entitlements because that's what's driving a lot of the budget deficit. And we agree the long-term budget deficits are also a threat to our national security. So I hope that they will make their colleagues understand how serious a challenge this is. We'll start to take steps to make it possible to get the kind of resources for defense that we need. There are a lot of specific recommendations in there, for instance, on the defense industrial base, which is not just authorizing multi-year procurement, but funding multi-year procurement, easing other kinds of problems, some of the defense trade controls that Seth was just talking about. There's plenty of stuff, and not least doing their jobs, getting the defense bills, both the authorization and appropriations bills, passed on time every year so the department can have predictable sources of funding and doesn't have to go through this stop-start of continuing resolutions that create so-called color of money problems for the Department of Defense, because if you're under a CR, you can't do new starts on a program. And we've got to get beyond all of that and understand that we're facing, in essence, a national security emergency that we have to treat appropriately. And then I hope they'll educate the public, educate their constituents to this, that they'll talk about this during the election coming up. I mean, has anybody heard any of the candidates, whether for president or vice president, mention any of this? I mean, I haven't.
Nope.
We need to have the public educated, and this is an opportunity. Our commission runs until November. Our statutory reporting date was November. We worked really hard to get done in July, in part because we hoped that this set of issues would be discussed during the campaign. I hope that happens.
Well, I definitely want to have you back to talk about the candidates when they do put forward these ideas. And maybe we'll even, Seth, bring in our good buddy, Elliot Cohen, and we can have a round robin. That's definitely something I will look forward to. But in the meantime, thank you so much, Ambassador Edelman. Thank you so much, Seth, for being here. Really appreciate your insight.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. From Into Africa, The Asia Chessboard, China Power, AIDS 2020, The Trade Guys, Smart Women, Smart Power, and more. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like iTunes and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog.